I'm Gene Kuleta, editor of the Latin America Advisor at the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington. The administration of U.S. President Joe Biden has launched initiatives on labor issues in Latin America. They include a program last year to strengthen independent workers' organizations in Brazil, Colombia, and Peru. And the Department of Labor recently awarded a $3 million grant to help workers in the sugarcane industry in the Dominican Republic. We're joined by Thea Lee, the Labor Department's Deputy Undersecretary for International Affairs, and she joins us from here in Washington. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Jane, for having me.
Now, first, with regard to the grant to help workers in the Dominican Republic, could you tell us what will this $3 million be used for, and why is this program important to the United States?
Sure. Thank you so much for asking. Well, the U.S. Labor Department has been working in the Dominican Republic for a very long time, since about 2009 at least. And there have been repeated, and there's also been a trade case that was filed in 2013, particularly with respect to the sugar sector, where the concerns are that there are workers, both of Haitian descent and Haitian migrant workers, that are working in the sugar sector in the Dominican Republic. And these workers have been very vulnerable because many of them lack legal status, they lack documentation. And that means that some of them have been subject to conditions, including forced labor type of conditions, where they don't really have the mobility or the freedom to leave or to seek another employer. And that can lead to abuses. So we've been concerned about that. And this project, the $3 million project, is called Strengthening Worker Engagement, Empowerment, and Trust in the Dominican sugar sector. And so what we hope to do is to really work with some groups that are on the ground, some of the community organizations, unions, the government, the companies, to strengthen workers' ability to advocate for themselves, to form organizations, unions, independent, democratic unions, so that they can stand up for their own interests. So that's the goal of this project, and we're really excited about it. We think that this will be a way for us to be really proactive in an area where there's been some concerns, some egregious worker rights abuses that have occurred, and we just want to make sure that we are in good dialogue with all of the folks who need to make changes in order to address those conditions.
Human rights abuses in labor situations in Latin America is something we've covered quite a bit too. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that also. And you mentioned businesses. Could you tell me a little bit more about how the Biden administration works with businesses in the private sector in Latin America and the Caribbean, and what that partnership is like and what that cooperation is like in order to prevent human rights abuses, investigate rights abuses when they happen? What is the state of that cooperation, and how does that work?
When we visit workers in the sugar sector, we are always in conversation with the businesses, with the private sector. And when there are problems in a sector, we always will bring it to the attention of the businesses, because the first best answer is for the businesses to address these problems, to solve them on their own. We also work very closely with the government. In the case of Dominican Republic, we've had a good, strong partner in the labor ministry, but obviously more needs to be done. And I think what we see here is really a systemic problem, which is that the Dominican Republic Constitution changed in a few years ago to take away the citizenship of Haitians, people of Haitian descent who are born in the Dominican Republic. And that leaves these folks really stateless, essentially stateless. And that means that they are really vulnerable. They are in a precarious employment situation, and they are really subject to abuse. But we're working with all the employers, because we need them to understand, first of all, what are their responsibilities, what are their obligations, what are how to meet the international labor standards, which is, as Dominican Republic is part of the DR-CAFTA, so they have made commitments to comply with international labor rights, freedom of association, right to bargain collectively, and prohibitions against child labor, forced labor, and discrimination in employment. And so, and right now, as you know, I think that there's been a withhold release order issued by the Customs and Border Protection against one particular company, Central Romana, which is responsible for quite a bit of the sugar exports from the Dominican Republic. And so we are always, in conversation with that company, and as well as the other companies, to see if we can mitigate address, remedy the abuses that have been brought to light.
I know you were in Colombia last November also to discuss issues related to labor there and also commitments under the U.S.-Colombia Trade Promotion Agreement. Could you tell me what your main objectives were in that trip and what were your findings coming out of it?
So we went to Colombia last November in order to meet with the new government there and to check in on the labor provisions under the U.S.-Colombia Trade Promotion Agreement. And we had a very productive set of meetings with the Labor Ministry, but also with the Trade Ministry and with the Attorney General's office, because some of the concerns, as you are, I'm sure, aware, in Colombia have to do with violence against trade unionists. And that was definitely one of the issues that we wanted to delve into. But I would say that the outcome was very positive, that we got some strong commitments. We had a long conversation with the Labor Ministry about their plans for labor law reform and how they want to protect workers' ability to form unions, to organize, to bargain for themselves, how to address some of the longstanding problems with respect to violence, not just against trade unionists, but certainly that has been a concern of the labor movement in the United States and human rights organizations as well. And it wasn't really a fact-finding trip as much as it was a dialogue with the government, but I think we felt that we had a strong set of conversations, a good partnership, a good open communication, and we look forward to following up with the government of Colombia about the labor law reform, about workers' rights to organize unions of their own choosing, and about the solutions with respect to violence against trade unionists.
Another certainly big issue that has been taking up a lot of the administration's energy is migration. As we're talking about all of these labor issues, could you tell me where migration policy and labor issues sort of intersect? I imagine that it's, if I'm not misspeaking, part of the administration's goals to create better labor opportunities, better employment opportunities in Latin America in order to eliminate the need for some folks to migrate out of the region. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and how that sort of intersects with migration policy?
This is absolutely a nexus of the two things that this administration cares a lot about, which one is protecting workers' rights, including freedom of association and collective bargaining. But the other is addressing what we call the root causes of migration, which is that workers often leave not just because they don't have a job, but sometimes because they have a crappy job. And so making sure that workers have the ability to exercise particularly the right of freedom of association, the right to join a union of their own choosing without fear of retaliation, without interference from their employer, without interference from their government, is a really essential part of sustainable economic prosperity and also democracy. That is one of the key ways in which workers really need to be able to advocate for themselves, to advocate in the political system. And we see that in too many places in Latin America, those rights are very at risk. And so we are absolutely very engaged in Northern Central America, in Mexico, but even in South America, to make sure that we are doing everything we can in using our trade agreements, the leverage of our trade agreements, our technical assistance programs to build up and strengthen workers' voice, worker power, because we think that is the way of building sustainable change and changing the balance of bargaining power between workers and employers, and to make sure that workers can exercise those rights. So, obviously it's not a short-term fix. That's not going to change the economy or the political situation overnight, but we do think that it is essential for a medium or a long-term fix. If we are going to solve the problems, we can't just have this cycle of poverty where workers have such terrible jobs and they're so vulnerable and they're mistreated and they don't have the ability to earn a living for themselves and their families. They will leave. And so we see, and actually we've seen there's an academic study in Honduras where many of the workers in the maquiladora sector in Honduras, as a result of an initial agreement with Fruit of the Loom, have successfully organized their unions that are led by women, and they are bargaining for better conditions, better working conditions, better living conditions, more safety at work, better wages. And that has actually reduced outmigration amongst those workers with a collective bargaining agreement by about 25%. So we think that is an important tool in the toolbox.
Ms. Lee, we'll have to leave it there. That's about all the time we have for today, but I very much appreciate your joining us today.
Thank you so much, Gene. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thea Lee, the U.S. Labor Department's Deputy Undersecretary for International Affairs, and I'm Gene Kuleta, editor of the Latin America Advisor at the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington.